Worlds are colliding, where a single meeting will have a significant effect on Russia, Ukraine, Europe, Iran, Taiwan, and the two parties actually doing the talking. Yes, Trump has traveled to China for a series of meetings, and for perhaps the first time since a Cold War-era summit, basically everyone is forced to pay attention. Although Taiwan is the main event of that conversation, just as it remains the main event in a potential World War III, and certainly something that we will return to in future videos. The more interesting and proximate strategic problem is Iran. It is also the one that has the biggest spillover effect on Europe. And indeed, this plus the Taiwan question appear to have dominated the conversation between the two leaders. The summit comes in the wake of rumors that China is or was preparing weapons shipments to Iran, with Beijing denying that accusation, and Trump saying that the United States had already intercepted a gift for Iran. Meanwhile, the dominant political narrative is that Trump enters the summit in a weakened position. He has not made a trip to China in about a decade, and he delayed this visit due to the start of the war in Iran. I am sure that he had hoped that the war would be over by now, which, friendly reminder, it is according to the administration, if you are asking in regard to the War Powers Resolution. But it is not over by any sensible measure. So, for today, we need to discuss the current dilemma that China finds itself in. Because despite being in the same counter-coalition as its unlimited partner Russia, Beijing has fundamentally different incentives as it relates to Iran. And that, in turn, leads to some interesting questions about what type of aid Iran may receive, which also helps us contrast why the peace process with Russia has gone precisely nowhere. As a starting point, as we increasingly frame the world at war in this tangled web of alliances and antagonism, we must not forget that war is costly. And I do not just mean that in the classic lines on map sense. I am saying that Iran fighting the United States is not inherently good for China, even if Iran does well in the war, and even if China does not participate in any meaningful sense. Yes, there is an obvious benefit to China here if Iran simply fights, never mind wins. The entire counter-coalition is built on having a mutual interest in weakening the United States, so that each can break the part of the world order that it dislikes. For the PRC, that means an easier pathway to integrating Taiwan under the mainland's control. Hold that thought for a minute. The key dilemma is that China is also in the business of making money, and the Iran war is making that difficult. The surface problem is that China is more dependent than anyone on oil flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz. Its manufacturing sector and growing middle class need a steady intake of black gold, but it can only produce about 30% of the stuff domestically. Geographically, the obvious place to import from is the Middle East, which is why so many of China's contracts are pointed there, or at least were pointed there. Short term, all of those voided contracts have created energy upheaval in the country. Medium term, which at this point we have already ventured into, the shutdown is not backbreaking. Oil is a commodity, so China can just continue importing from elsewhere. The problem is that a 20% cut in global supply causes prices to surge everywhere, as even US consumers are well aware. But the complaints that US consumers have made in response are quaint by international standards. A supermajority of Americans rage against Donald Trump, but an even larger supermajority continue paying the gas premium anyway. It is the joy of being a rich country. Compare that to very poor countries, which are entirely pushed out of the market as a consequence of the high prices. Now, China is not one of those very poor countries, but it is not as wealthy on a per capita basis as the United States or most European countries. The IMF ranks it 73rd in the world by purchasing power parity, one slot down from North Macedonia. The combination of middling per capita wealth, but an enormous number of people, might mean that China is bearing a higher cost for this war than anyone other than Iran. Yes, even higher than the United States. And yes, I am saying that in the immediate aftermath of Hegseth testifying to Congress that the war has cost US taxpayers $29 billion thus far. At the beginning of the war, I said that Iran generally being in chaos was not the worst outcome from Washington's perspective, because of the implications regarding China. Well, we are starting to see that principle in action. The standard caveat applies here on how obtaining accurate estimates on this is impossible, but a 50% increase in oil prices results in as high as a 1% decrease in China's GDP. Note that China has relatively strong GDP growth overall, so this will not result in a recession, just lower growth than it should have. There is a concerning second-order effect baked into this. China's economy is primarily based on manufacturing for export. That strategy requires a large group of willing buyers worldwide. Other countries hitting recessions therefore causes extra pain to China. So too does higher shipping costs due to fuel shortages. As a result, China's year-on-year export growth in January and February was 21.8%. In March, it sank to 2.5%, when the short-term shock paralyzed some industries. In April, it rebounded to 14.1%, though analysts believe that that was temporarily boosted by precautionary stockpiling, and that the numbers will drift back down if the disruptions continue. One small final note on this subject. Much has been made about Iran learning of its power to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Putting aside the amateur's fallacy point that states cannot learn what they already know, the public discourse on this has not drawn the same conclusion that the United States has learned of its power to close the strait as well. While the United States has not truly learned that for the same reason, we are observing that power demonstrated. Iranian oil, the stuff that China might need in the event of a war over Taiwan, has been blocked off without much of a challenge. Moreover, the United States has done this the hard way by seizing vessels trying to run the blockade. The easy way to do this would be to instead shoot them, as Iran has done with its half of the blockade. I suspect that the United States would not hesitate to opt for the easy way if World War III were in progress. Again, I do not want to suggest that Beijing was clueless about this ability 3 months ago, but it does not receive the proper attention in the public sphere, and it is an important input in how Beijing thinks about the region. Putting all of this together, and trying to understand how this fits within the broader conflict coalitions, China has mixed feelings about the Iran war. Higher oil prices are bad. Global recessions are bad. But watching the United States discharge its already thin supply of munitions, that is very good. It is good directly because each tomahawk fired at Iran is a tomahawk that cannot be fired at a staging port for a Taiwan invasion. It is also good because arms deliveries to Taiwan will be further delayed, emphasis on further, because this was a problem before the war started. And it is a step even better because deliveries prior to an invasion are more valuable to Taiwan than delivering during an invasion. Good luck having them arrive in one piece. And thus, you have a weird situation where China would like to see an end of the war, but not necessarily an end of US-Iran hostilities. An end of the war is a top priority for China because it means that Hormuz reopens and the oil turmoil begins to dissipate. A complete end of the hostilities between the United States and Iran is less attractive, though. A grand bargain between the parties that covers everything up to and including a nuclear deal would mean an end of the sanctions regime against Tehran. That would, in turn, mean an end of the discounted oil that China previously imported from Iran. And it might mean that the United States reorients more of its forces to the Indo-Pacific. Still, because of the current economics of the situation, China may be in a better position with hostilities ended than with the status quo persisting. Contrast this to Russia's position, which is best served by a continuation of the status quo. As long as the strait is locked down, then the Kremlin can ride the surging oil prices to continue to fund its war effort. Well, at least insofar as pink birds of Ukrainian origin do not interfere with export logistics. A stalled war also continues the stall in US arms shipments to Ukraine via NATO ally purchases. Thus, the status quo is much better for Russia than a resolution of the conflict on any terms, even those favorable to Iran. These misaligned incentives of the counter-coalition incentivize each member to invest more in armaments, because they cannot rely on each other for support in the event of war. But when there is consensus, there is more to reallocate, especially when one of the parties is willing to pay. Contrast that to the traditional Western coalition's incentives, which are broadly aligned on principles of liberal trade policy and democratic governance. But those are public goods. Thus, you get an underproduction of security in that field, but at least more agreement on how to apply the coercive force when it becomes necessary. Obviously, the Trump administration has deviated from this path in some unpredictable ways. But the order existed before him, the order will still exist after him, and these incentive structures will be what the next administration will have to deal with in a few years. And that takes us to the final point about how China would want to manipulate the bargaining incentives here. If you look at the stories about how China is allegedly supplying Iran with military equipment, many take for granted that this is an obvious choice given the current geopolitical alignments. Indeed, I too would classify this as not particularly surprising, though given our earlier discussion, I would add all sorts of caveats to the argument. Where those conversations tend to go off the rails is by implicitly arguing that such aid inherently makes the United States more likely to settle. Now, that is true if you stick to exactly what that sentence said. But if you extrapolate the claim to such aid inherently makes a settlement more likely, then things have again gone off the rails. As with any other form of military aid, the first-order effect of Chinese donations is to shift the balance of power in a manner favorable to Iran. That indeed makes the United States more willing to settle. A greater portion of possible deals look more attractive than fighting a war. But which deal is actually on the bargaining table is a function of Iranian politics, and an emboldenment effect on Iran fully offsets the stifling effect on the United States. That is because however less powerful the United States becomes, is exactly how much more powerful Iran becomes. Remember, bilateral expected war outcomes are zero-sum. However, what causes war is the presence of bargaining frictions, and the conversation regarding aid makes no mention of those. Moreover, those bargaining frictions can break either way, depending on what you think is driving the conflict. For example, if you believe that the United States is trying to exploit a short-term military advantage due to domestic unrest in Iran, then yes, short-run Chinese military supplements counteract that effect. That is good for getting a deal done. But if you think that the parties disagree over who will outlast each other, and Iran is on the weaker end of the spectrum, then military aid can exaggerate the differences between a weaker and a stronger type of Iran. That encourages the United States to fight to sort out the difference, rather than potentially make a larger overpayment to a weaker type of Iran. If China only wanted Iran to win the war, then this would not matter too much. But as the first half of this video explained, China has strong incentives to build a peace, and the aid could disrupt that. The elegant solution here is one that will sound familiar to those following the Russia-Ukraine peace process. Conditional support to Iran is both more likely to result in an extended ceasefire and be under more favorable terms to Iran. For example, suppose China pledged to arm Iran if the United States refused a deal where both sides end their blockades, but there is no change to Iran's nuclear program. It forces Washington to rethink the value of that agreement, because the alternative now looks worse. But it also prevents Iran from becoming more belligerent, because China also withholds aid if Iran refuses those same terms. Of course, for any of this to work, China would actually have to follow through on its aid commitment when push comes to shove. From a political willingness perspective, this is plausible. That stands in contrast to the United States playing that role in the Russia-Ukraine war. No one believes that the Trump administration will approve aid to Ukraine, and thus the United States holds little leverage over Russia. Although Beijing does not have the same political credibility problem, it does face a logistical problem. Aid sent to Iran actually has to arrive in Iran, a tricky proposition when the United States is currently blockading the country. An airlift is the alternative, but that would quickly get hairy in the event that full-scale hostilities resumed. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? China has mixed incentives with Iran, despite what it seems based on both the current political coalitions and much of the public narrative. This highlights a broader difference in the way that the two coalitions are constructed. And getting the outcome that China wants is not as simple as handing Iran more weapons. Meanwhile, I can hand you 90 more minutes of me discussing the broader possibility of a war between the United States and the PRC over Taiwan. Click here for that. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.